And looking good. And the Arab world had always taken personal hygiene seriously. Unlike Christian Europe, Arabic public baths were an old tradition inherited from the Roman Empire. These became fashionable in Europe when the Crusaders came home, but with one crucial difference. They were open to men and women at the same time. Perhaps inevitably, they turned into brothels. London tried to regulate this trade and began licensing brothels in 1161. And while the church still vociferously disapproved of any sexual activity, there were many within the church who could appreciate the commercial possibilities. In London, brothels were officially licensed, and many belonged to no less a person than the Bishop of Winchester, and the women in them were known as Winchester geese. While back in France, the French king, Louis IX, made prostitution illegal in 1278. Mark you, this proved so unpopular he had to repeal it 2 years later. And when King Louis went on crusade, the account books show that he was paying 13,000 prostitutes to keep the troops happy. The church eventually named him as a saint, though not because of that. There must have been times when the church felt that it was on a losing wicket, trying to stem the constant tide of sexual activity that kept the human race going. But occasionally, nature would give her a hand, as happened towards the end of the 15th century. As that hardline Protestant church reformer John Calvin put it, God has raised up new diseases against debauchery. In fact, it was just one disease, but it was serious enough to transform the sexual landscape. We know it as syphilis. Syphilis first appeared in 1495 in Naples here. A French army, which consisted of men recruited from all over Europe, had captured the city. With them, they had 800 prostitutes. And when a Spanish army joined them, the new disease broke out and everybody started blaming everybody else. The French called it the Neapolitan disease, and the Neapolitans called it the French disease. The army was decimated, and the surviving soldiers were sent home to spread the disease to wherever they came from, all over Europe. Soon in northern Italy they were reporting a new illness, the Spanish disease. England caught the French pox. In Poland they had the German illness, while in Russia they were going down with the Polish sickness. It reached Scotland in 1497 and India in 1498. From there, Chinese junks carried it to Canton by 1505. In 10 years, syphilis had girdled the earth. Across Europe, one of the first reactions to the disease was to declare a war against prostitution, which, as far as hygiene is concerned, probably wasn't a bad idea. In 1546, Henry VIII closed down all the brothels in London, while in Paris in 1560, prostitution itself was declared illegal. In Germany, one prostitute was savagely whipped and had her fingers chopped off, and men were punished as well. But it was women who bore most of the blame for the new disease. As far as men were concerned, it was all their fault, and all the fault of their insatiable sexual appetites. If only men could exert more control over women and over their desires. The only snag was that in those days, nobody, or at least none of the men, had much idea of what made women tick sexually. It was an enigma. Well, it may come as a surprise to learn that the answer was one of Columbus's great discoveries. But not Christopher Columbus. He found something much bigger. This was Rinaldus Columbus. He was an Italian lecturer in surgery. And in 1559, he announced to the world that he had discovered the seat of women's delight. He had discovered the clitoris. It gives Columbus Day a whole new meaning. Now, we're not suggesting there's any connection, but the century following the momentous discovery of the clitoris saw the rise of a new prudery. Puritanism was in part a reaction to what was seen by some as the licentiousness of the Roman Church. and it certainly provided some novel solutions to the perennial Christian quandary between condemnation of sex and the natural urges of men and women.
In rural areas of northern Europe and New England, the Puritans tried a curious way of controlling premarital sex. The courting couples were allowed to go to bed together, but with a bundling board in between them. That way they could talk, but not touch. Of course, this method relies on the well-known fact that young people have no more sex drive than their elders, and far less ingenuity.
The greatest challenge to the Church was not to come from hordes of sex-crazed pagan worshippers or from profiteering brothel owners. The great challenge came from the rise of scientific discovery. But oddly enough, instead of embracing sexual activity as part of the human experience, the scientists still clung to the old Christian aversion to sex. But with this difference, they tried to provide a scientific rationale for it. Sexual desires that had been sinful, were now seen as signs of illness, and as always, women seemed to suffer most.
If they, for example, participated in such things as masturbation, if they certainly had sex before marriage or sex after menopause, those were all thought to be examples of women's abnormal sexuality, and in that case, a woman might have been diagnosed a nymphomaniac. Women might have their ovaries removed, and the other, less frequently performed operation, but it still happened in both England and America, is a clitoridectomy, where women's clitoris would be removed.
And it wasn't only women who could suffer as a result of masturbation. Men, too. Dr. Atisso, a medical advisor to the Pope in 1760, published his research showing that playing with yourself drives you mad.
Dr. Atisso medicalized, if you will, masturbation. Now we had a reason, that if you had too much sex, if you masturbated, or then you would go crazy, blind, make hair grow in your hands, make you become an imbecile. And so many men were castrated, resort to castration in order to not have this sex drive, and then you couldn't touch yourself to relieve yourself.
A less drastic solution was urgently needed. And since tasty foods like ham and eggs were supposed to increase a young man's libido, in 1898, one Dr. Kellogg offered a replacement breakfast.
Cornflakes were invented to stop people from having sex drive and stop them from masturbating. Dr. Kellogg was trying to develop a grain or a food to reduce the sex drive.
The only trouble was, Dr. Kellogg's original cornflakes were so tasteless they were hard to sell. So the original formula was made tastier, destroying the anti-libido effect, and he walked off in disgust.